Hi guys, I hope you're doing well, and in this video we're going to be discussing about why does the aggregate demand curve slopes downwards. So let's get started. Now I've drawn an aggregate demand curve over here which slopes downwards. That is from, now when you say that it slopes downward, it means that it's going to be moving downwards from the y-axis to the x-axis. On the x-axis we will be labeling real GDP, that is real GDP on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we will be labeling price level. We are labeling price level because we are measuring CPI or the inflation on the y-axis. A lot of students make the mistake of writing prices on the y-axis, not prices, it's price level, right? Because you're measuring inflation on the y-axis. On the x-axis we are going to be writing real GDP, that is the real national output. Anyways, so I've drawn an aggregate demand curve that is downward sloping, and you can see clearly that if I'm measuring price level on the y-axis and real GDP on the x-axis, and then the curve is sloping downwards, it means that there is an inverse relation between the price level and the real GDP, and this inverse relation is demonstrated by the aggregate demand curve. So the aggregate demand curve is basically telling us that there's an inverse relation between price level and real GDP, and it tells us that, for instance, if price level rises, right? So if price level is P1 and the real GDP is Y1, so if the price level rises from P1 to P2, right? If it rises from P1 to P2. Now guys, in order to denote real GDP or national income, we are going to be using the alphabet Y because Y stands for national income, right? And we know that national income is equals to national output in the economy. So by the way, so if price level rises, our real GDP goes down, it falls, that is national income, national output, and real GDP goes down, which is represented through a contraction in aggregate demand. So it's representing that your aggregate demand is contracting. So a rise in price level would reduce your real GDP, that is demonstrated through a contraction in AD. While on the other hand, for instance, if price level goes down, let's say if the inflation decreases in the economy from P1 to P3, let's say if the inflation, your price level goes down, your real GDP, that is your national income, extends from Y1 to Y3. So your aggregate demand curve is basically extending, and this is representing an extension in aggregate demand, while this was representing a contraction in aggregate demand. So from this diagram, we can clearly see that there is, guys, an inverse relationship between the price level and the real GDP, which is demonstrated through a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Now the point to understand is that why is there basically an inverse relation, or why does, when price level decreases, real GDP rises, or why does real GDP falls whenever price level rises? So let's see. Now I'm going to be erasing this so that it becomes a bit more clearer. So now let's see. So I'm going to be taking the example where I'll say that I am going to be decreasing the price level, let's say from P1 to P2, and I can say that my real GDP is going up, that is from Y1 to Y2, it's increasing. My real GDP is increasing, my national income is increasing, right? And why is that? What is the reason that a decline in price level would extend my aggregate demand, or it would increase real GDP in other terms, right? Now, what is that reason? There are three reasons, or you can say there are three effects that play that role. The first is the wealth effect, the second is the trade effect, and the third is the interest rate effect, and we'll see each of them now. Guys, for example, let's consider about the wealth effect. Now, wealth effect is basically telling us that whenever price is going to fall, right? Wealth effect is telling us, the wealth effect is basically telling us that whenever our price level is going to fall, right? Whenever the price level will fall, whenever inflation will go down, basically the real value of our incomes would go up. So the real value of our incomes would actually rise. So the real value of our incomes would rise, which would kind of increase our purchasing power, because our real value of incomes are rising. So when purchasing power of an individual would go up, right, what would happen? They would start spending more money. So consumer expenditure will go up. And that is why I've written that the wealth effect, it impacts the C component of aggregate demand. The wealth effect impacts the C component of aggregate demand. So C starts to rise. Your consumption expenditure starts to rise because a fall in price level increases the real value of incomes, so you can buy more basket of goods and services than before. Hence, individuals start spending more. As a result of that, consumer expenditure goes up. And as a result of that, aggregate demand extends, not increases, extends. So the reason when you say that aggregate demand is extending, it basically means that it is extending because of a decline in price. That is, the extension in AD is caused only and only because of a fall in price level, right? So because that price level falls, that actually impacts your real GDP. And how does a fall in price level impacts real GDP? What happens is it impacts real GDP through impacting consumer expenditure. So what I'm saying is that if price level is going down basically, and you say that real GDP is rising, so one of the reasons why real GDP would rise is that consumer expenditure would start rising. And that would be shown by an extension in your aggregate demand curve. But again, you guys need to understand that here consumer expenditure is not independently rising. It's not that C starts to independently increase. In fact, here the consumer expenditure is dependent on the change in prices. Or in my example, here the consumer expenditure is dependent on the fall in price. Remember that this is a very important distinction that we need to make, guys, okay? The second reason why a fall in price level would actually impact our real GDP or would cause our national income to rise or real GDP to rise from Y1 to Y2 is the trade effect. Now guys, the trade effect tells us that whenever price level falls, right? Whenever price level falls, I'll write the heading trade effect. It tells us that whenever the price level falls, what's going to happen is that our exports would become competitive because it becomes cheaper, right? When the inflation goes down, our domestic goods become more competitive in terms of relative to other countries. So that would make our domestic goods cheaper, and so would it make our exports cheaper as well. In fact, it would make our exports competitive. When our exports would become competitive, the demand for exports would go up, and when demand for exports would go up, export a higher volume of goods, which would actually increase our export revenues. So our export revenues would go up. On the other hand, what happens is that since the price level in the domestic country or economy is going down, so what happens is that our domestic goods become more cheaper as compared to imports. So instead of consumers importing goods from abroad, they would start preferring domestic goods because they have actually become more competitive as compared to imports. And imports have become less competitive, domestic goods have become more competitive. Since imports become less competitive, since they now are expensive as compared to domestic goods, because domestic inflation in the economy is going down, that has made our domestic goods more cheaper and hence more attractive. As a result of that, in terms of price, as a result of that, what would happen is that the demand for imports would go down, and as a result of that, your import expenditures would go down. So if I say that export revenues are going up and import expenditures are going down, I could fairly say that the value of my net exports, that is X minus M, would actually go up. And when the value of my net exports would go up, my aggregate demand should go up. But I wouldn't say increase, I'll say that my aggregate demand extends. The only reason is, why am I saying that my aggregate demand extends instead of saying aggregate demand rises, is because the better way to put it forward is that aggregate demand extends because the value of the net exports is going up solely and only because of a fall in price level, which means that your net exports were not independently increasing. These net exports were not independently increasing. In fact, they were dependent on the fall in the price level. And when that happens, it would cause a rise in real GDP through a rise in your net exports. And that will be shown by movement along the aggregate demand curve. So basically, the reason why AD is extending or real GDP is going up is because of the trade effect, not just the wealth effect, but the trade effect is telling us that, you know what, if price level goes down, your net exports would go up, and that would increase your real GDP. Since exports are rising, definitely your real GDP would go up, your national income would go up, and since you're benefiting domestic firms because you're buying domestic goods instead of imported goods, then definitely real GDP and national income would go up. Now, coming to the third reason, that is your interest rate effect. Now, guys, the interest rate effect is basically going to tell us that, for instance, if inflation falls, that is price level goes down, what will happen is that a fall in inflation. So guys, you see that central banks do not prefer the inflation rate to go down below the targeted limits. So the macroeconomic objective for the targeted inflation rate is between 2 to 3%. So we are good enough, or we can say that, there is price stability being a macroeconomic objective if the rate of inflation is between 2 to 3%, which indicates price stability, or you can say it indicates mild inflation. So anything below 2% would be the central bank would actually bring changes or manipulate the monetary policies in order to, bring the inflation within the targeted limit. So if inflation rate is going very down, below 2%, let's say, so what will happen is that if this happens, if the price level goes down below 2%, let's say, or below the targeted rate, what will happen is that a central bank would immediately kick in, and what they would do is that they would actually, reduce the rate of interest. They will reduce the interest rates, and reducing the interest rates would have two impacts. It would, first of all, in fact, three impacts. And what would happen is that it would, reduce your cost of borrowing. So cost of borrowing would go down. And when cost of borrowing goes down, it becomes cheaper for consumers to borrow. So they borrow more money, they spend more money, and then aggregate demand extends because of that. So if cost of borrowing goes down and your consumer expenditure rises, so the C component of AD, increases basically, but not independently, dependent on the price level, because that was the reason why it happened, right? So it impacts C, that is obviously is going to impact C. And then we could also say it's also going to impact I, that is your investments. And the reason is that since cost of borrowing goes down, it becomes cheaper for firms to actually borrow more money from banks and then invest in machinery and equipment, right? So investment goes up as well, and that is shown through an extension of AD, and that causes your real GDP to go up. So this is how. And then there's another way. So it's going to impact your I component of AD, as well as it's also going to impact your net exports as well. Because if interest rates go down, less people from abroad would save money into our banks to earn the interest. Because the reason is that getting a low relative rate of return. Since interest rates have declined, the relative rate of returns would go down as well. And people would prefer from abroad to, save their money or deposit their money in some other countries' banks instead of our domestic banks. So basically that would decrease the hot money inflows, and that would decrease the demand for our currency. And when demand for our currency would go down, basically our currency would depreciate. It would weaken our exchange rate, and a weakened exchange rate basically makes our exports more cheaper, while it makes our imports expensive. So again, the net value, or you can say the value of our net exports, would actually go up. So again, yeah, that's the concept. So this is the way in which the interest rate effect can actually impact our real GDP. It impacts C, it impacts I, and it impacts X minus M, that is the X minus M component of AD. Because the interest rates go down, it weakens our currency because less hot money flows into our country's banks. And as a result of that, since the currency weakens, it makes our exports more competitive, artificially competitive, you could say. So it increases the demand for exports, since exports are now relatively cheaper, while imports have become more expensive. And as a result of that, the value of our net exports go up, and so does our real GDP would basically go up, shown through an extension of an aggregate demand. But guys, one very important thing that needs to be understood over here is that this is an extension of the AD curve. It's showing a rise in aggregate demand that's causing a rise in real GDP, but the rise in aggregate demand in the sense of an extension in AD. Remember guys, whenever C, I, G, or X minus M would independently change, for example, if C starts to rise, I starts to rise, G starts to rise, or net export starts to rise, not because of, I'm repeating, not because of changes in price level, but they independently start changing because of some other factors which we will discuss later. And if that happens, the aggregate demand curve will shift either to the right or to the left. So guys, in our next video, we're going to be now discussing the factors that can actually cause a shift in the aggregate demand curve. I'll see you all around in the next video. Until then, take care.